and most certainly those defenders working on issues related to territory, land, and the environment. Last year we issued a major report called We Defend the Land with Our Blood, and we noted that defending human rights has become one of the most dangerous professions, vocations, callings in Latin America in general, but that the increasing stigmatization and threats and attacks, killings faced by defenders fighting to uphold indigenous rights or to protect the environment when faced with large-scale mining, hydroelectric projects, logging, has taken that sense of risk to a whole new lethal level. In 2015, 65% of the murders of human rights defenders working on land and environment issues in the world were from Latin America. And this is where it gets really close to home for us as Canadians, because Canadian mining companies are everywhere, all over the world, and they're certainly at the front lines of those situations throughout Latin America. Close to 1 year ago now, the government adopted new guidelines for Canadian officials to strengthen the support we offer to human rights defenders around the world. Good news, an important development. And very significantly, those guidelines acknowledge that human rights defenders who are working for rights related to land and the environment, often in situations involving corporations, are absolutely deserving of protection under those guidelines, regardless of the nationality of the corporation. So regardless of whether or not that corporation is Canadian. That's a real step forward, but we absolutely now need to see some substance. So let me wrap up just with 5 quick suggestions of some of the things we need to be pushing governments to do to start to reverse this trend and start to bolster, once again, the protection of human rights defenders. To take us back a bit to that 1998 moment in Paris with the Declaration, which was supposed to be about consolidation and celebration of the role human rights defenders play. First is, governments do need to start celebrating defenders. We need to call them out on that and insist that they celebrate defenders. They need to do so at every single turn to recognize the legitimacy of defending human rights and lend their public support to that work. Second, we have to address the safety concerns. Governments need to work to provide a safe and enabling environment, and governments like Canada need to play a role in pressing that to happen in other countries, to ensure that the punishment, the reprisals, the intimidation comes to an end. And very central to this is we need to move to ensuring that those responsible for these attacks against human rights defenders are going to face justice. Third, resources and support. Governments need to facilitate and support programs that will guarantee that human rights defenders have access to the necessary skills and tools and training they require to carry out their work. Fourth, participation and access. We need participatory approaches that will ensure that human rights defenders are connected with each other, able to support each other within their communities and nationally, and that they have real and meaningful access to decision makers. And then lastly, and this maybe speaks a bit to us, particularly as Canadians, demonstrate true conviction. Let's show we mean it. Stand up for human rights defenders over profit generation. Stand with land defenders over irresponsible mining development. Make it clear that we do truly realize and embrace the notion, expressed powerfully in those words from the UN Special Rapporteur, that defenders are, at the end of the day, the lifeblood that our democracies need to flourish and survive. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for these remarks, and I'll now take you a little bit on a related path, which is the question of women's human rights defenders and women's organizations fighting for sexual and reproductive health and rights, which is what my organization works on. The International Women's Health Coalition is based in New York City. That's where I am. And we work globally with women from all over the global south, from Africa, Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East, to advance sexual and reproductive health and rights. And by that we mean women's control of their bodies, their fertility, their sexuality. And that includes access to safe and legal abortion, to contraception, to maternity care, to sexuality education, HIV prevention, other services and information that are essential for women to be able to assert control over their bodies. And because we do that work with feminist groups from all over the world, we're really on the front lines of some of these struggles for equality and control of the body. And therefore we know all about the attacks that these organizations face as we work closely with them. I should just mention that we at the Coalition do direct advocacy as well with feminist groups from all over the world on these issues at the United Nations. And we also are an intermediary funder, so we receive money from large donors in the United States and then in turn fund feminist groups on the front lines in those countries. So we have multiple perspectives, both as an advocate and as a funder. And I have experienced some of these challenges ourselves as we now, sitting in the United States in the age of Trump, are starting to feel some of the pressures that some of our colleagues have felt for a very long time. Now, I agree, the answer is yes. Civil society under pressure, absolutely yes. And by that, I want to speak specifically about organizations working to advance women's rights, because as you'll hear in my remarks, there are also organizations that are actively working to undermine women's rights. They would consider themselves civil society, but they're not the organizations that I'm going to be concerned about tonight, although I will mention them in what I'm about to say. So there are the two sets of actors that are really attacking organizations working to advance sexual and reproductive health and rights and women's rights are, first of all, the group of organizations that you could describe as the ultra-right-wing, often religious groups or religious-inspired groups who invoke culture and religion and traditional values to challenge the right of women to control their bodies and fertility and sexuality. And the focus here is the body, really. The control of the body, which of course we as feminists know is essential to true women's equality. It's fundamental. Without that, there are many other things that are not possible. Continuing your education, gaining meaningful employment, engaging in political participation. Without control of the body, I can only think of one of my grandmothers who had 12 children, being from Quebec. That is the reality of unprotected sex with men. You're constantly pregnant. So this is pretty fundamental, and this is why we fight for it, but because nothing that has happened since has changed that basic fact. And the groups that challenge that control of the body have waged their attacks along two lines. There's two well-known lines of attack. One is attacks on the right of women to access safe and legal abortion, which we're all familiar with, and that has been something where actually human rights arguments have been used and misguided human rights arguments have been used to try to create personhood in the fetus and to equate the rights of women to the right of a cluster of embryonic cells. And that is, it has been an extremely fierce battle that they've waged with a lot of money, including support, institutional support from the Catholic Church. And I'm speaking as a lapsed Catholic, but clearly the Catholic Church has been one of the main protagonists in this battle. The other line of attack, the other ideological concept, is what is called anti-gender ideology, which is a more recent line of attack, and it's really gaining ground very quickly. Now we see it a lot in Europe, in Russia, and in Latin America. And what this is about is saying that, again, this is hardly new, that sex is deterministic. In other words, your biological sex is your destiny. And boys will be boys, which means they'll be aggressive and dominant and, heads of households and, leaders of countries. And girls will be girls, therefore, motherly, subordinate to their husband, taking care of the house and home. That is also their destiny because of biology. So the line of attack rejects the notion that gender is actually socially constructed, that social roles in society and in the family are really, taught to us from an early age. And of course, because it denies women the possibility of creating a different future for themselves, basically denies women's equality, and frankly is actually an attack on all of human rights. If women are inherently unequal, then the whole edifice of human rights crumbles, because everything is determined by biology, and our struggles are to not, right? We should just go home and abandon all of this. So that's one line of attack, and it's been couched often in cultural terms, like, these are Western notions or Northern notions, or they're not Asian values and they're not African values. And we see that, as is deployed against our colleagues in Africa and Asia. And of course, these Asian and African feminists object to this very much, because they say, very sorry, but we're also part of our culture, and we will have a voice in defining our own culture in our own context. And it's not the patriarchs who will be, have sole say in what could constitute culture in Nigeria or in India. But the battle is on, and these are powerful forces. And this has led to, for example, I'll give you an example. We work closely with women's organizations in Kenya, and for years and years, women's organizations have been pushing for a new constitution. And in 2010, there was a constitutional conference that led to a new constitution for Kenya with a very progressive Bill of Rights. And Kenyan women's groups fought very hard to ensure that access to safe abortion was included as a human right in the Bill of Rights of the Kenyan Constitution. And after much struggle, obviously, you can imagine, they succeeded. And so there is a right to abortion in the Kenyan Constitution, which states that any provider, when he is with a woman and she tells him that she needs an abortion for whatever reason, if he determines that there's a health need, can just go ahead and provide, right? So that's a very broad right. But immediately after that happened, the Catholic Church mounted a counterattack and actually was able to, we think, to corrupt the Ministry of Health and prevent the issuance of the guidelines that would have allowed hospitals to actually execute this new constitutional provision. So the battle is constantly on. We finally get it in the constitution in Kenya, and then they manage to block the guidelines at the ministerial level. So that's one line of attack. The second line, the group of actors, are actually the populist and authoritarian governments, which have been on the rise everywhere, as noted by Alex. And again, they invoke traditional values, or some foreign conspiracy, some Western, Northern conspiracy, to challenge women's organizations. And they often use the vehicle, which you noted, of issuing new guidance for registration or new regulations on foreign funding. Again, the notion is to try to demonize organizations, feminist organizations, by claiming that it's all a Western plot or a Northern plot, and that feminism is inherently a foreign concept. And this, of course, is often done for the entire sector, but it sweeps up a lot of feminist organizations at the same time. And in India, for example, Prime Minister Modi forced civil society organizations a few years ago to re-register en masse, which has led to the loss of status of tens of thousands of organizations. And a lot of women's organizations that are very grassroots at the community level did not have the resources to be able to jump through the hoops of actually re-registering in this new environment, and basically lost their status, which has frozen their activities. Last week, the government of Poland, the Kaczynski regime, which is a very right-wing government, the Law and Justice Party, the government raided the offices of women's organizations, Polish women's organizations working on violence against women. They had participated in anti-government protests the week before to commemorate the first anniversary of the Black protests. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but a year ago, women's groups all over Poland occupied the center of all towns in Poland, all dressed in black, with black umbrellas, to protest an attempt by the government to totally ban abortion. And they were able to scare the government into withdrawing that proposal to totally ban abortion. Abortion is already pretty severely limited in Poland since the early 90s, but this would have been a total ban. And the women were able to intimidate basically the government into pulling the proposal off the parliamentary agenda. But so a year later, they celebrated the protest with another huge march. The government didn't like it, so retaliated, and it seized the files and the computers of these organizations to investigate wrongdoing by the Department of Justice of the Polish government. But of course, who got penalized? It's the women's organizations whose files and computers were seized and whose operations have been stopped. So those are, so the two main actors that at the moment the women's movement that is under attack is dealing with, the religious groups and then these authoritarian populist government. And this is happening not only in Poland, not only in India, but also in Egypt, in Turkey, in Hungary, and now in the United States, where our government is clearly not supportive, or the federal administration is clearly not supportive of women's rights and has waged a multi-pronged attack on women's rights, including reproductive rights. So women's groups are fighting back. Obviously, we're never going to take it lying down. We're fighting in the media, we're denouncing at the global level. We've been very active at the United Nations, actually reporting these situations. We're active at the regional level, so the Polish women's movement has been going to Brussels and to the European Union to present the situation. We are, of course, in the streets. As you know, we're marching. We had the women's marches in January, but women are marching everywhere and almost constantly at this point. But it's extremely challenging, and we're definitely feeling the full force of these lines of attack. And at this point, frankly, what this means is that we're holding the line and trying to prevent rollbacks rather than advancing the women's rights agenda, which is, of course, to your point, years after the Beijing Conference on Women, years after the International Decade for Women's Rights, here we are, holding the line against these kinds of attacks. So that's that. I mean, I have to tell you that I, sitting in the United States as an organization that is very critical of the Trump administration, I'm fully aware that we can face that crackdown ourselves. The Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration in its time, conducted a lot of audits of organizations whose work it did not like, sent the International Revenue Service to many organizations working on reproductive rights and sexuality. This could very well happen to us, so I'm fully aware. So our books are in excellent order, and my controller is ready to meet them head on. And we are fully aware of that also because we've been named as a foreign funder of organizations abroad. We've been named as a foreign funder of Turkish organizations as well as Polish organizations by those right-wing groups who are no doubt in close touch with the Trump administration. So they're on to us, but we're waiting for them.